The text today was one of those ones that I resisted going to. Not because it's anything in particular objectionable about it. It's just that when you have to preach on miracles, you bring a lot of baggage into the discussion that you can't get to in the preaching moment. But I challenged myself years ago that if I detect any note of resistance to a preaching text, that may be the invitation to go directly at it. And so I hope you will pray with me as we look at one of those miracles that you might be very familiar with. But this is the Gospel of John's version of that familiar story. After Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias, a large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for Jesus himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. They filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Will you pray with me? Gracious and merciful one, thank you for this word. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for this preaching moment. Hallow this moment as your own and speak a word of life to your people, life-giving words, transforming words, not my words, not words from this weak vessel, these lips of clay, but your revealing words to your people who crave a word from you. In your many names we pray. Amen. All 4 Gospels have a version of the feeding of the 5,000. This miracle story has a long history in the oral tradition of the Jesus movement and the early church. And scholars agree that the presence of the story in all of the Gospels, the presence of this story in various tracts of oral tradition indicate that it remains a critical narrative in the canon of sacred writings about Jesus' life, ministry, and identity, giving us confidence that it probably recounts some historical event that actually occurred. However, the nature of how the miracle happened is left to speculation and interpretation. But I do want to assure you, it makes sense to wonder how it is possible to feed more than 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish and have some left over. I can tell you that challenge in my own cupboard and refrigerator. And I think to avoid the questions this miracle raises, we tend to rely and spiritualize the feeding of the 5,000, highlighting the Eucharistic imagery and liturgy found in the text. And we have great poetry and great liturgy that bring out those imagery. They really help in our own worship. And I know you've heard me say it many times, but engaging in an extended debate about how the laws of nature explain the miracle, and in the case of my atheist friend, try to explain away the miracle, will only distract us from what Jesus is trying to teach his disciples and by extension us. In this case, as John tells the story, I suspect that John wants to give us a window into Jesus' demonstration of radical hospitality and the miraculous transformation that happens when we embrace it and act upon it, regardless of how impossible things may seem. Now, the Gospel of John goes further in helping us get past the drama and spectacle of miracles and see them as signs. John is not interested in calling them miracles. John wants them to be referred to as signs with the understanding that they are pointing to something, pointing somewhere. And so in our reading of this story, I ask us to reflect on to what or to whom does Jesus' feeding of the 5,000 point? How do we bridge a world where Jesus miraculously feeds so many with so little to our current time in a way that we have a view in mind of the outcome or experience to which the miracle points? Let me be more specific. What if the story is less about a supernatural event than it is about the power and expansiveness of the grace of hospitality? What if this story is not about hunger? After all, John never says that the people are hungry. What if it's not about hunger, but about radical hospitality that upends the rules and logic of our cultural and economic transactions? What if this is about that kind of hospitality we offer our neighbors because they are our neighbors, not because it is expected, needed, or commanded? And so as John tells it, a large crowd arose to follow Jesus in response to the previous signs Jesus had performed. They had heard about Jesus healing the man who had lain on a mat for 38 years. And so when they heard that the man got up and took his mat to walk, they followed Jesus because he healed the sick. Now, John doesn't tell us if Jesus healed anyone in the crowd that day, but when Jesus sees the crowd, he asks his disciples where they will buy bread to feed them. John says Jesus asked the disciples the question, knowing what he would do. What was it Jesus had in mind to do? Was it another miracle? I cannot imagine that Jesus wanted Philip and Andrew to see another miracle. After all, they had already seen Jesus do miraculous things, turning vast stores of water into wine. Oh, that's a miracle. They had seen Jesus heal the man on the mat and saw the man get up and carry his. Did they need to see another miracle? Whatever Jesus had in mind, The disciples' imagination failed them, and they are not to be judged for that. But their imagination failed them. Philip responds that we do not have enough money to buy food for so many people. Andrew concludes that the little food he sees within the crowd, like the 5 loaves and 2 fish from a boy in the crowd, wouldn't help much in feeding so many. So the disciples' assessment of the situation and their attempt to respond to the dilemma are practical, reasonable, and logical. It's reasonable, logical to conclude that there's nothing that we can do. And yet Jesus does not let himself be bound by what is practical, reasonable, or logical. He does not limit himself. He does not prevent himself from responding and to acting because it is practical and reasonable and logical that they couldn't do it. Jesus knew what he was going to do. He was going to show radical hospitality. No matter what the situation was, Jesus was going to take care of the people. He was going to embody the prophet Jeremiah's oracle that God was going to raise up a righteous branch of David, a good shepherd. Is that what the grass is all about? A good shepherd who would tend to the welfare and well-being of the people. And I call the hospitality radical because they had appropriate and justifiable reasons to refrain from any attempt to feed so many people. Yet Jesus would not accept the limitations of the disciples' logic and practicality as a reason not to show hospitality. I can just see it now. We don't have enough money, Jesus. There isn't enough food. Let's do it anyway. Let's do what we can anyway. And so Jesus instructs the disciples to gather the people to sit, and he took the bread and fish and he fed all the people, and everyone was satisfied, and there was food left over. And then now I see you saying it now. But preacher, how did it happen? How did it happen? Oh, but see, that's where I want us to go today. What if Jesus' starting point was not a miracle? What if Jesus' starting point was nothing so remarkable as the supernatural multiplication of 5 loaves and 2 fish? What if it's not the miracle? But what if it was the show of radical hospitality that unleashes the miraculous? Oh, you're not convinced. All right. What started as a decision to show radical hospitality amid scarcity became a miraculous reshaping of expectations, a reshaping of relationships, reshaping of the concept of abundance. The miraculous occurred after the decision to do something, to respond. The miraculous creation of a beloved community occurred because Jesus showered grace on people because they were simply in his presence. And because Jesus decided to feed the people, they experienced the miracles of Jesus' hospitality. They experienced the miracle of satisfaction, wholeness, and fullness. I don't know how, but they were satisfied. And it all started because Jesus responded to them in their presence right there with them, not just because of their hunger or emptiness, but because simply they were there. Could it be that is what the sign points to? The miracles that happen when we show radical hospitality. What miracles might we behold if we offered radical hospitality to all comers just because they are and because we can, without always counting up the cost or outsourcing the job to the government or to another nonprofit, but simply responding the way Jesus did. Here you are, here you go. Of course, the people misunderstood what Jesus did after they were fed and satisfied. They were so enthralled by the miracle that they wanted to make Jesus their king. And Jesus was not looking for power or accolades. That Jesus withdraws from the people indicates that Jesus does not want our response to be awe at the miracle witness, such that we want to anoint him, consecrate him, or worship him as a king. Perhaps Jesus wanted us to see to where the sign was pointing. Perhaps Jesus wanted us to see the fullness that we have all received, grace upon grace from God. And then in our show of hospitality and caring for the people, we too may experience miracles. The grace of hospitality transforming the conditions of scarcity, poverty, and injustice right before our eyes. And that's why I wonder if this story is about how radical hospitality unleashes miracles, unleashes the miraculous. Perhaps God is most present, creative, and responsive to our demonstration of radical hospitality to others. When Jesus embraced the humanity of those who just showed up, approaching them with dignity, equity, and compassion, others may have responded when they saw his hospitality. Perhaps that's one way miracles happen, acting from a radically hospitable foundation and letting the chips fall where they may. I am reminded of the great activist Dorothy Day of the Catholic worker movement. And in her books, Loaves and Fishes, she gives testimony to how the miraculous just happens without even us looking for it. She talked about feeding so many hungry people, day in and day out, people coming in and food. They are just giving food and food, feeding people like it never ends. It never ends. So many hungry people, and we have to bring more food. And she concludes, the food never runs out. Dorothy Day doesn't explain the miracle. She testifies to the miraculous. They never run out of food. We've seen it happen in our own lifetime. The support offered to our neighbors immediately when the call goes out during a disaster or during destruction. Food coming, help coming, everybody joining together. It's miraculous. And on the other side of the equation, we know what the absence of hospitality means for our society. Just look around and see when we don't approach our neighbor with a place of hospitality and love. Our nation has given up showing hospitality to the immigrant, seeking to close off our welcome and our border to those looking for a better life. And that withdrawal of hospitality has left us so mean and divided and mired in xenophobia and fear and threat of our neighbor. We have people who have withdrawn their hospitality to diverse people in their schools and workplaces, rejecting any effort at diversity, equity, inclusion, characterizing such things as a threat to everybody. Such that we don't even care about bringing different people and different perspectives into our lives. We have the renewed efforts to withdraw hospitality to LGBTQ people, especially our transgender and gender nonconforming siblings, with states passing laws to exclude trans people from school activities and from medical care. It has made our neighbors who were once kind, seem so cruel and violent against their neighbor. We've seen what happens when we do not approach each other with the hospitable, loving heart. And so I love Jesus, the miracle worker. I still have great memories of vacation Bible school when Jesus was my hero and he could do anything. But perhaps we can see Jesus less as the miracle worker and more as the good shepherd who offers us the bread of life. Looking at Jesus this way, he becomes for us an invitation, a prompt, and a model for radical hospitality, provided not because anyone asked us, commanded us, or expected it from us, but because hospitality is our calling and purpose, and miraculous things can happen when we act on it. Oh, can we imagine what God could do with our show of radical hospitality? What God can do with our willingness to just start from that place of giving, taking care of, showing up for our neighbors. Not the safe hospitality where we do a cost-benefit analysis or we have the logic and calculations about whether we can do it and how much we can do, but radical hospitality. The radical hospitality that unleashes miracles in our midst, miracles of relationship, miracles of abundance, miracle of God's presence that confounds the logic and the transactional nature of our marketplace lives. It is with the power and promise of radical hospitality that we don't have to fear that we don't have enough. We don't have to send anybody away. We do not have to allow the fear of insufficiency to cause us to neglect any help we can offer. And of course, I know there will be days we will be just like the disciples. We're going to have to. This mess of a world is too big, and the things we want to do cost too much, and we don't have enough, and we have to come and ask people for offerings. It's going to feel also just out of bounds and impossible task to accomplish. But I assure you, we need not withhold our gifts and our resources because they cannot meet every need. We bring what we have. We start from a place of radical hospitality. Bring what we have. Let God use it and stand in awe of the miracles our hospitality will unleash. May it be so.